At the base entrance, the furious Admiral pointed his finger. "Get out of here! You don't deserve to stand on this airfield." The small woman clutched her bag, walking quietly under contemptuous stares. A young pilot laughed. Just another dreamer. But less than an hour later, in the hangar, emergency alarms screamed. Radar detected threatening signals. Through the chaotic radio waves, a calm female voice emerged. "This is Falcon 9. Do you copy?" The entire F-22 squadron froze in unison, whispering, "That's impossible." "Is that really her?" Reina Vasquez was 34 years old, with long brown hair and wearing worn maintenance coveralls. She had once been a Top Gun pilot, but withdrew after a personal tragedy. Currently, she lived quietly as a contract maintenance worker at the Air Force Base, invisible among the mechanics and ground crew. She was regularly mocked by the younger pilots. "You're only good for cleaning aircraft windows." "Top Gun? Don't make me laugh. Someone like you could never handle a real fighter jet." Reina remained silent, continuing to polish the F-22's windscreen without responding to their taunts. Admiral Rossfield had always despised people who quit the military. When he saw Reina lingering near the hangar, he exploded with anger, shouting loudly in front of many witnesses, "I don't want to see you here for another second. Get out now." Reina bowed her head, gathered her belongings, and walked away under mocking stares and whispered comments. Gossip spread throughout the base. She got kicked out right to her face. Pathetic. Couldn't even defend herself. Why was she even allowed on base in the first place? An older maintenance worker later recalled, "I saw her pause for just a second, take a deep breath, then keep walking." She didn't argue or beg. Her steps were heavy, but they were straight and dignified. What none of them knew was the weight Reina carried with every step. 12 years ago, she had been the most promising pilot in her Top Gun class. Her reflexes were legendary. Her precision in the cockpit was unmatched. She was destined for greatness. But during one critical mission, she had hesitated for half a second before engaging a target. That moment of human uncertainty had cost her wingman his life. The guilt consumed her completely. She requested immediate discharge and disappeared from the aviation world, choosing to work around aircraft, but never again as a pilot. For 12 years, she had maintained her cover as just another maintenance worker. She cleaned the same aircraft she had once flown with distinction. She serviced the weapon systems she had once operated in combat. Every day, she watched younger pilots take off and land, knowing she could outfly most of them even after a decade on the ground. But she kept that knowledge buried, hidden beneath the persona of someone who had never belonged in a cockpit. The pilots saw her as a failed wannabe. The officers saw her as someone beneath their notice. The maintenance crew saw her as competent, but unremarkable. None of them suspected that the quiet woman who polished their aircraft had once been considered the best of the best. None of them knew that Falcon 9, the legendary call sign whispered about in pilot training programs, belonged to the woman they had just watched get humiliated and thrown off the base, until crisis struck and hiding was no longer possible. 1 hour after Reina's public humiliation, emergency alarms screamed throughout the entire airbase. Radar systems had detected unidentified signals penetrating restricted airspace. The F-22 squadron prepared for an emergency scramble, but their communication systems were malfunctioning. Commands were garbled. Coordination was breaking down. In the sky above the base, one of the F-22s reported critical problems. "Mayday! Mayday! I'm losing control. Hydraulics are failing." Admiral Rossfield shouted orders, but the signal interference made his commands unclear and contradictory. The control tower was in chaos. Young pilots panicked over the radio. "We can't understand the instructions. Systems are failing across multiple aircraft. We need immediate guidance." Through the chaotic radio waves filled with static and overlapping voices, a calm female voice cut through the noise. "This is Falcon 9. Do you copy?" The entire squadron fell silent. Falcon 9? That call sign had been spoken of like a Top Gun legend, but it had disappeared over a decade ago. Reyna had secretly entered the auxiliary control room and activated the emergency communication channel. She had watched the crisis unfold and knew that, without intervention, multiple aircraft and pilots would be lost. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had been through countless emergencies. "Flight leader, reduce throttle 20%. Adjust auxiliary control surfaces. Maintain heading 090. The struggling pilot followed her instructions precisely. His F-22 began to stabilize, pulling out of what had been a potentially fatal dive. "Falcon 9, how do you have access to this channel?" came a confused voice from the control tower. "Focus on the emergency," Reyna replied calmly. "We can discuss authorization later." She continued providing clear, precise instructions to multiple aircraft experiencing various system failures. Her guidance was so accurate and professional that the pilots followed without question, even though they had no idea who was giving the commands. In the hangar, mechanics and pilots gathered around radio speakers, listening in amazement as the mysterious voice systematically guided each aircraft to safety. "That's impossible. That voice sounds like Falcon 9. But Falcon 9 disappeared years ago. Who else could handle a multi-aircraft emergency like this?" One by one, the F-22s landed safely, despite their various malfunctions. What should have been a catastrophic loss of aircraft and lives had been prevented by the calm professionalism of a voice from the past. A control room technician later recalled, "The entire room went silent when we heard that voice. Nobody said anything, but we all knew we were listening to a pilot who had flown through death itself." When the last aircraft touched down safely, the emergency frequency fell quiet, except for the sound of normal air traffic control operations. Admiral Rossfield stood in the control tower, his face pale with the realization of what had just happened. The woman he had humiliated and thrown off the base less than an hour ago had just saved his entire squadron. The same pilots who had mocked her competence were now alive because of skills they had never imagined she possessed. As the immediate crisis passed, everyone began to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The quiet maintenance worker they had dismissed and ridiculed was actually one of the most skilled pilots any of them had ever encountered. The question now was, what would happen when she emerged from the control room and faced the people who had just discovered her true identity? After the last F-22 landed safely, Reyna emerged from the auxiliary control room to find dozens of stunned faces staring at her. The pilot she had just saved ran toward her. You're really Falcon 9? Admiral Rossfield stood frozen, unable to find words for the first time in his military career. The truth could no longer be hidden. Reyna acknowledged what everyone had just witnessed. 12 years ago, I was the top graduate of my Top Gun class. Call sign Falcon 9. The story emerged in pieces, each detail adding weight to the already heavy atmosphere. During a combat mission, she had hesitated for half a second before engaging an enemy target. That moment of human uncertainty had resulted in her wingman's death. The guilt destroyed her confidence and her career. I requested discharge immediately, Reyna continued, her voice steady but pained. I chose to live anonymously, rather than risk another pilot's life because of my failures. Admiral Rossfield, still processing the revelation, spoke harshly. You abandoned your duty? You quit when the military needed you most. But the young pilot, whose life she had just saved, stepped forward. Sir, with respect, if she hadn't been here today, I would be dead. The entire squadron could have been lost. The news spread throughout the base like wildfire. The woman the Admiral humiliated at the gate is Falcon 9. Pilots who had mocked her competence hours earlier now avoided eye contact. Ashamed of their previous behavior, maintenance workers who had treated her as just another pair of hands began to understand why she knew aircraft systems better than most engineers. Control tower operators realized they had been listening to one of the most skilled pilots in military history providing guidance during the emergency. A young flight instructor approached hesitantly. Ma'am, the stories we heard about Falcon 9, about impossible missions and perfect execution under pressure, those were all true? Raina nodded quietly. Every mission was real. Every life saved was real. And so was every mistake that cost people their lives. But today wasn't a mistake, the instructor continued. Today, you saved an entire squadron. Other pilots began to share their perspectives. I couldn't understand how a maintenance worker knew so much about aircraft systems. Now I realize you weren't learning about these planes. You were remembering them. The way you handled that emergency, that wasn't luck or quick thinking. That was years of experience under the most extreme conditions. A flight controller added, When you spoke over the radio, every pilot immediately followed your instructions without question. That kind of authority only comes from proven competence. Admiral Rossfield listened to these testimonials, his anger gradually being replaced by a grudging recognition of what had occurred. 12 years ago, you made a mistake that haunted you into retirement, he said finally. Today, you prevented a disaster that would have destroyed multiple families and damaged this entire program. Raina looked at the faces around her, some curious, some respectful, some still processing the revelation. I didn't come back to prove anything. I just couldn't watch good pilots die when I had the knowledge to help them. The young pilot whose aircraft she had guided to safety spoke up. Ma'am, whatever happened in your past, today you reminded all of us why Falcon 9 was legendary. Not because you never made mistakes, but because, when it mattered most, you knew exactly what to do. The gathering crowd began to understand that they were in the presence of someone who had chosen to carry the weight of past failures rather than risk future ones. But they had also witnessed that true skill doesn't disappear, even when it's buried under years of guilt and self-imposed exile. A seasoned maintenance supervisor who had worked alongside Raina for months spoke up. I always wondered why you seemed to understand these aircraft at such a deep level. Now I know I was working with someone who had mastered them long before I ever saw my first fighter jet. The revelation changed everything. The woman they had dismissed, mocked, and humiliated was actually one of the most accomplished pilots any of them would ever encounter. The question now was, how would this knowledge change the way they saw not just Raina, but their own assumptions about the people around them? The next day, Raina sat alone in the mess hall, eating cold soup with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout her ordeal. The soldier who had mocked her most cruelly during her time on base approached her table. He set down his food tray beside her. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. If it weren't for you yesterday, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. Other pilots silently nodded respectfully as she passed through the dining area. No dramatic gestures or speeches, just the simple acknowledgement that passes between professionals who understand competence when they see it. Admiral Rossfield entered the mess hall and paused, looking at Raina. For the first time since she had been on the base, he didn't shout or express contempt. He simply observed, perhaps finally understanding the depth of his misjudgment. A young pilot stood up and addressed the room. "I want everyone to remember something from yesterday. The person we looked down on turned out to be the reason our entire squadron is still intact today." There was no applause or cheering, but the atmosphere was heavy with respect and recognition. From that day forward, the chair next to Raina in the mess hall remained empty, not because people were avoiding her, but as a silent acknowledgement of the space that exists around someone who has carried the weight of life and death decisions. A flight instructor approached her after the meal. "Ma'am, would you consider sharing some of your experience with our newer pilots? Not about combat tactics, but about judgment under pressure." Raina considered the request carefully. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach anyone about good judgment. My track record includes significant failures." "With respect, ma'am, your track record also includes yesterday's success. Maybe both experiences are what make you the right person to teach." That afternoon, Raina found herself in a briefing room with several young pilots, not as the maintenance worker they had dismissed, but as Falcon 9, sharing lessons learned from both victories and mistakes. She began to realize that her past didn't have to be a burden she carried alone. It could be wisdom she shared to help others avoid the mistakes that had cost her so much. Admiral Rossfield observed from the doorway, finally understanding that true leadership sometimes comes from people who have failed, learned, and chosen to serve others, despite their own pain. For the first time in 12 years, Raina began to think that maybe Falcon 9 deserved to exist alongside the quiet maintenance worker who had been trying to disappear. People easily shout, "Get out of here!" Easily laugh at someone they consider useless. But they don't realize that within that silence lies an entire legend who chose to bury herself. Raina Vasquez didn't need to prove herself with words, only with one call through the sky. This is Falcon 9. The lesson is profound. Never judge a person just because they stay quiet or have failed once. They might be the very reason you survive tomorrow. Behind every apparent failure might be someone carrying the weight of being too successful at things that matter most. Heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they hide in plain sight, waiting for the moment when their skills are needed most. If you believe that quiet heroes deserve to have their stories told, leave a dot in the comments. And if you want to hear more of these stories, subscribe to SN Quiet Stories